I'm going to try and get through this very quickly because Arielle and I were adding quite a lot to our talk no less than half an hour ago. So, and we actually have some after lunch snacks for you guys. In a brown lunch bag underneath all your seats is a little series of samples. And we'll be going to kind of go through those as carnal illustrations of what we're talking about, because I think when you talk about food in these very general, heady kind of ways, there's no connection to what we actually are doing when we eat, which is taking something inside our bodies. But we are from Copenhagen. This is a restaurant where I spent the past 6 years working at. It's an old whaling warehouse, and it's nice. It's on the waterfront. We can seat 45 guests per service, so that's 45 for lunch, 45 for dinner. And yeah. One of the really amazing things that Noma does, and when I tell people this, they're often hard for them to believe that we don't make any money. Because every cent of profit either goes into hiring another chef so that we can accomplish more in the kitchen, or building a facility like this, which is something that we have entirely for our staff as a place for them to decompress, read books during the 5 minutes if they have it, or an hour that we have for eating dinner. This is our test kitchen, which is a small little kitchen that is devoted only to coming up with new dishes for the restaurant. It's intentionally set a little bit just slightly off of one of our prep kitchens, and so has a small amount of physical distance from those, but close enough where we can kind of interact quite well. But also conceptually, it's much more like this in-between of a service kitchen and a home kitchen to kind of give ourselves a headspace to really work on it. This is where we spend our 80 to 90 hours a week working on the new dishes. So when we talk about food and the way that we work and the way that we spend all of our time, it all comes back to flavor. Everything that we do, the way that we interact with the world, the way that we think about concepts, about innovation, all comes back to flavor. And this is what I think I'd really like to center this short talk about, is that the sort of relationship that Arielle and I have forged in the way that we are combining cookery and scientific investigation in what we feel is a relatively novel fashion. A lot of science, or correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of times scientists will be kind of drizzling a small amount of knowledge on cooks in terms of techniques or ways that things can happen, or a cook will come with a very rudimentary question that the scientist then answers 4.5 years later with having data logged 1,000 different variations of that. And so there hasn't been a very practical or useful combination of these two fields.
And in fact, like coming up through, 4 years of chemistry undergraduate and 5 years of flavor chemistry graduate school, the sort of idea that I'd be going off and working with these guys and actually like taking information from them and then designing research around it was like why would you do that? Like, that's not what we do. We take inspiration from ourselves. But
so we're going to start off with a first little tasting, which is this little kind of sachet here. You can unfold it and just pop it in your mouth. Avoid the paper, or I'll leave that up to you. I'm not going to tell you how to eat. But this is a very simple type of fermentation, and isn't really technically a type of fermentation. It's an enzymatic transformation of garlic. So basically, this is just a head of garlic that we control humidity, temperature, and time. 3 of the 5 parameters of which you can sort of dial in or control any type of fermentation. And so this has been sort of just basically kept at 60 degrees, around 80% humidity for 2 months. And what you have is a very sharp, harsh, although often quite nice, garlic flavor. It's been transformed into something much more sugary, caramel tones, dark flavor. The way that we sort of, this is what is on the screens now is one of the first fermentations that we developed at the restaurant, which was the fermentation of split yellow peas and barley. This was analogous to the miso-style fermentations in Japan, and I sort of whimsically called it piso, not knowing what to kind of call this new product. And subsequent to that, all the cooks have kind of taken that so part of the word and applied it to anything that we use that technique for. So we have hazel so, walnut so, rye so, which is a miso made of walnuts. But the way that we sort of develop dishes and concepts in the restaurants, the best metaphor I've been able to kind of talk about this process with is that of a sentence. If you consider a dish as a complete sentence, we at the restaurant start from zero. So we basically need to come up and invent letters. And that's what we're doing in our fermentation kitchen, where we're kind of trying to develop base building blocks, simple flavors that at least I and most of us have never tasted before. These then kind of come together and you start playing with a bunch of different of these building blocks, and we'll string them into a word, which could be a sauce or a way of cooking a pumpkin. And then you kind of string these words together, and we finally have a dish which we're proud enough to sort of serve our guests. So the storage that we used to have there was very shade tree. It's more or less an attic above our dry storage, where we could kind of open a window during the summer, sort of drag a space heater up in the winter, move 100 kilos of it up and down depending on the temperature. Then we graduated to this, which was a sort of a forlorn and decrepit, no longer working fridge, which we put a heating blanket from that you'd normally put underneath a tile floor in a bathroom. Actually worked extremely well for monitoring temperatures. And then last year we constructed a new facility just specifically for controlling our fermentation processes. So I guess a year and a half ago, Renee came to me and said, I believe that fermentation is where this restaurant needs to look into to progress. This is where we think food is going to be able to generate new flavors, new concepts. So we need a fermentation kitchen. I said, that's amazing. That's what I want. How much money do we have to spend? And he went, 0. We didn't have enough money to build a normal insulated kitchen, or like basically what you'd use, like an insulated walk-in refrigerator that we could even use for that. And looking here and there, I stumbled upon the idea of shipping containers. And so we stung refrigerated shipping containers, cut some patio doors into them, separated into 7 chambers. We were running them off of PID controllers with infrared heating panels in each one of them, and a misting system for controlling humidity. So we can control the temperature of each chamber from -30 Celsius to +60, and full humidity control within that range, which gives us the ability to create a perfect environment for that. Of course, we had to sort of cobble this together, and as you can see, Arielle and I did the wiring ourselves.
In fact, I think some of the other speakers' presentations actually cost more than our entire lab to produce, so there'll be a lot of slides like that.
Yeah, so there's, that's, unfortunately, it looks like a doomsday prepper still. But we're happy. And
yeah. That's where we get to work. I mean, it's nice because we kind of came to this place converging on like separate quests for flavor. So like you as having this mandate to use whatever techniques and ideas possible to wring as much flavor out of the Nordic biome as you could, and me just generally being obsessed with the chemistry and mechanisms of flavor, but looking for something useful to apply it to.
Yeah, so I guess we should just talk about how Ari and I met. It was 3 years ago?
Yeah,
4
like
years
3.5.
ago. Yeah. So at the time I was looking into this question about insects, and because a lot of our inspiration and techniques and the way that we think about food comes from other places in the world, and then we try and apply that paradigm to the sort of products that we have in our part of the world. And so I was struggling with this stigma of Westerners against insects as food. And when you look at the sort of success and how we in the Western world are a huge minority among those who don't consume insects for food, it becomes quite puzzling. So at that time, I was looking into social insects, ants, because they have a very wide and high level of complexity in the sort of compounds that they produce. Being social animals, they communicate through pheromones. So different pheromones will allow them to sort of signal different processes that the ants need to do. And Arielle had been working for 2 days in the laboratory.
Kind of talked my way in.
And I was looking at something like this, and she walks behind and goes, "Oh, what are you looking at lemongrass for?" And I was like, this girl has no idea what the fuck she's talking about. And she basically had walked past the computer screen, recognized the molecule that I was looking at on the screen, and said, that's what lemongrass looks like. And so then it turned out that all these pheromones that the ants were used for communication are basically flavors, because it's the same molecule. We can taste all these different things. So here's her proudly holding up the pheromone lemongrass. And I think it's, what is it, like leather?
Leather, lavender, there's some from pine. And
there's one of them that tastes, one of our sous chefs said it tastes like a mint condom. I don't know. I didn't really want to get into that one. More flavors.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that was really, I think, like a eureka moment for us, because separately we had all the knowledge that we needed to make an insight, but it didn't come together till we actually came together to talk about it. So like you had this this need to find information about cuisine that was hitting up actually against the boundaries of what scientific knowledge we actually have, and I had this slightly obsessive store of chemical data in my head I was carrying around looking for something useful to apply it to. This discourse, though, doesn't really, happen that much, or enough, I don't think, between science and between chefs. But I really think flavor is the key for this type of stuff to happen. So I'm going to get a little technical on you right now, because we're talking about flavor. So what is flavor? Flavor is actually a composite sensation where you get data feeds from all 5 of your senses, and then your brain integrates them and interprets that information. Smell is the most important component of this. Smell is, unfortunately, I think, often considered one of the lesser senses, or like the lower senses compared to vision and hearing. But it actually is quite important when you look into it more. So of all the families of genes that we have in our genome, the largest one is devoted to the hardware of smell perception. So those are olfactory receptors. And that actually comprises 2% of our genome. And if you think back perhaps to grade school biology, 2% of our genome is the same amount of genetic information that separates us from chimpanzees. So basically, we've devoted this huge amount of evolutionary resources to the ability to smell things. Another reason that smell is particularly interesting in this context is like what we actually use it for. So the architecture, the physiology of our skulls means that we tend to use smell very heavily while we're eating. So not just smelling things in the environment, but actually using this conserved hardware to give ourselves information about our food. So what information is that? Well, so as you can see, compared to a mouse, another mammal with a delicate sense of smell, our sort of odor world is much more oriented towards flavors, food, and cooking. So, I mean, the molecules that we can smell are small volatiles, and these tended to be produced by the secondary metabolisms of plants, of animals, of other organisms, and are affected in their concentration and their makeup by many interactions between these things. So between organisms, and between organisms and the environment. So the takeaway from this is that food is in a lot of ways a complex interplay of interlocking interactions and systems, but we're literally built to intuitively interface with these through flavor. So that, to me, I think is one of the strongest impetuses to working on this stuff, is that we have the hardware, and cooks have amazing intuition and mental Rolodexes about these things.
Actually, we're going to start off with our first vial. It should be labeled number 1, hopefully.
Yes, so we're taking you back to our favorite ecological interaction, which is flavor. All right, fermentation. Should I go next slide?
I guess also, I mean, sort of pursuing what Arielle was also talking about, and sometimes we're in a room like this with a lot of amazing projects going on, and people say, well, who cares?
Yeah.
And not to sound trite, but I think it was Brilliant Severine who said, the discovery of a new dish gives mankind more pleasure than the discovery of a new star. And for us, we find, because we're sort of hardwired to interact with food in a very different way, it seems at least very logical to me.
Yeah.
So that one, yeah, you can go ahead and taste it. So this is one of the very first, or one of the very early ferments that we did. Because I've been working on the idea of a Roman garum, and the garum is a sauce that Herodotus talks about in ancient Greece, where it was something so precious that the legionnaires wouldn't go into battle without it. And you sort of read about something like that, and you say, fuck, I really got to try making something that good. Traditionally, the best, highest class garums are made with the stomachs of bluefin tuna. And not having a lot of bluefin tuna around Denmark, and not really wanting to kill bluefin tuna to take the stomachs to rot them, we started looking around and looking at different potential analogs in terms of composition of minerals, of proteins, of fats. And it turned out that grasshoppers were almost a perfect match, and so that became something for us to try working with. That was also when we sort of discovered, or made, for us, I would say, a major breakthrough in the way that we thought about fermentation. That is, not thinking of it as a particular type of food or a process or something very specific, but more as like a kitchen utensil, in the same way that you would think of as a saute pan or as an oven. This is Aspergillus oryzae growing on rice. And this is the tool that we use quite often. So basically, we have conceptually broken away from thinking of something as a process, and we basically have an open box, whereas chefs, because we like to experiment and we like to work very fast, we basically shovel as many different products into that box as we possibly can. We've been able to break down legumes in the same way that you would use in miso. We accelerate things like the garum that you just had. If we make a fish garum, a meat garum, actually in the restaurant we're trying to get quite close to as zero waste as possible. So any kind of fish scraps, meat scraps, vegetable scraps, we're being able to process into something else. Usually with a very completely different flavor profile, but something that can sort of reiterate and elevate the product that it initially came from. The mold on this rice, we actually grew it on kind of heirloom pearl barley in Denmark, has several different enzymes which are used. In miso, they use both amylase, which is primary metabolic process of consuming the starch and carbohydrates in the rice. It also produces protease, which we use to break down the proteins in sort of our meat-style garums. We can also use it as its own condiment. This is roasted, just simply sauteed in a pan, and because it has a bit of umami, a bit of sugar from the broken down carbohydrates, and some residual starches left, it actually tastes like if you were able to take bacon and French toast and smash them together into one thing. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, so as
Where you're gonna get an explanation about what actually happens,
Stepping on my line.
rather than my rhetoric.
Again, when you're fermenting, you're literally working like in concert with microbes to create new flavor molecules. So that's how that happens. Just like
Thanks.
that.
So actually, if you could try, oh God, number 4, please. This one's a lot more. It's now there's no fish or shellfish or anything in this one. So you can just try this. This is, again, a product that we were able to process with the barley. It's basically a soy sauce-like product that we've made simply from spent grains of coffee production. So basically, we saved all the coffee grounds that were being thrown out every day from our guests' coffee, added a little bit of moldy barley, a little bit of salt, a little bit of water, and 10 weeks later, we had that, which is, I think, a very usable and interesting product for us to try. So we'll go to number 3.
Vial number 3? Yeah.
Vial number 3, please.
Vial number Bachelor number 3.
So,
Bit of a palate cleanser,
yeah.
this one.
So this is Elderflower Kombucha, which is a tea that we make we make an oil out of elderflower, and then we use the leftover elderflower from that process and make a tea with that, and then we ferment the tea with a process, what they call a kombucha. Kombucha is a fermented tea, which uses what they call a SCOBY. That stands for symbiotic construct of
Colony of
symbiotic
bacteria
colony
and
of
yeast.
bacteria and
You can
yeast.
see one on the next slide, actually.
Yeah. So basically, you make a tea. You have a yeast part of this fermentation, which turns it into alcohol. But at the same time, because there's acidic bacteria living in the mix as well, it immediately turns it into a sort of vinegar. So you can have this very fast and constant fermentation. That's what the mother looks like, which is
Horrible.
well. I mean, you get very attached to these
Unlikely.
fermentations, and I can also often rhapsodize about how you need to take care of your koji and how because it is a living organism, and you do have the sense that that it is a collaboration and it is producing flavors for you that you can't manufacture or in a lab. I mean, I suppose you could, but there's such a level of complexity in the living organism, and especially the metabolic processes that it has and the compounds that it's producing through all of that. It allows you to create a lot of very unique and special flavors. And so we get, especially when we have interns come into the lab and they go, oh God, is the mother going to be okay? And then start taking all this really great care of it. In the same way, if you've ever made bread like Chad is going to talk about, or made beer at home, there's like this sense of wonderment that comes in that's very special. We also do a lot of lactic acid fermentation, which is more or less what you think of as sauerkraut, kimchi. We do it with plums. And again, this became like a very simple box where you could kind of insert a lot of different products to. So we do, we should do the dried settle.
Yeah, that's number 2, if you want to taste.
We do it backwards?
Yeah, just backwards. You just had 2. Oh, what's the next one then? Oh, 3, my bad.
What's that?
No, number 3, it's dried saddle.
Yeah. Number 3.
Yeah.
Number 3, guys. It's going to be okay.
We'll get through it.
So this is that is dried saddle, right?
Yeah, that's a
Yes.
dried saddle. 3.
You did 3.
We did 3.
Okay.
Oh.
So we'll go to the palate cleanser.
Go to the palate cleanser now.
So the one that you had 3 was actually dried saddle mushrooms. Sorry for that. We mixed up the. Like I said, we were working on the presentation very recently, so we actually shifted the order. So that's what you're having now is Elderflower Kombucha. What you had before is a broth that we make from elderflower.
Dryad saddle mushroom, which is like quite a large, woody, inedible mushroom that grows on trees, but then by lacto-fermenting it and adding koji, we can get this like delicious sort of tropical fruity flavor that you wouldn't actually find in Denmark otherwise.
Yeah, and so again, it's finding a product that you think has, that you can, as a chef, you can intuitively sense has purpose, but it takes a lot of sort of investigation and academic, scientific research to figure out a way that you can sort of translate the flavors that you feel are in there into something that is possible to produce in a general sense. And then we have, this is just sort of show that it's all not just a fermentation dog and pony show. But this is actually part of the process of a dish that we used to have on the menu called, well, the chefs at our restaurant used to call it forever beets, because you would take a beet and put it in a very 225-degree-Celsius oven, and then have to stand there, well, presumably while you're doing something else as well, rotating it every 5 minutes. That's because at that high heat, the beet would caramelize very intensely, but if you left it still, all the sort of juices would drip out of the beet. By constantly rotating it, and it didn't work to have a spear through it either, it would basically slowly allow a certain amount of moisture to stay in the surface of the beets. Most of it would sort of kind of concentrate into the heart of the beets, but it became this very meaty, intense, rich, almost like beet jerky in a way. Very, very dense, very hearty. And so that's like a process that we actually have a sort of nascent investigation going on at the moment, where really to come back and take a look at a lot of the processes that we have, again, intuitively as a chef use in the kitchen, but focus on what's going on in the minutia and so take it to the lab, essentially. So again, the way that we sort of cook and the way that we, for instance, recently did this in Japan when we went there, is we start off by simply tasting everything. We spent, I was there 4 times last year, sort of tasting lots of different products in Japan. Over the course of several months, we sort of found what we'd call a red line, something that sort of brought a concept in your head of how you thought Japan should taste. And this is something that we want to do, and we want to come in as, not as tourists, but aware that we are outsiders. And so to come in with very, very fresh eyes and very innocently in a way, like children. I think a lot of the ways that we try and cook at the restaurant is as if you were a child that had somehow traveled the world and learned techniques all over, but then you could come back and forget everything. So to come back and use a product with knowledge, but not baggage in a way, if that makes sense. So that's something that I guess one of the, also, if we were to be critiqued in a restaurant, it would probably be a logistical problem in that we can only serve 45 people for lunch and 45 people for dinner, which doesn't make it incredibly egalitarian. But one of the things that we're trying to do, and a lot of this is through this fermentation project, but also is that idea that you can kind of take these concepts and ideas and apply them to any part of the world. So a few weeks ago, a month and a half ago.
Yeah, it was in August.
Yeah, well, we're actually going down in 2 weeks to work with this young lady again. Her name is Chito Cavera. She has a nonprofit in Zimbabwe, which is helping young orphans sort of. Her main focus is teaching young orphans to grow mushrooms, which is a type of farming that you can do with basically no capital to start up money. Yeah. But we're going down there to hopefully give a bit of inspiration and sort of show people there that they have such a miraculous culture and such an amazing amount of ingredients and products and traditions to work with. Because a lot of times in a place like Zimbabwe, which has been so colonized or has such a heritage of colonialism, you'll have people where they have fields of millet and they'll harvest the millet and then they'll carry the millet 20, 30 kilometers and trade it in for white rice because that's thought of as a
fancier, higher grade.
A food of more value, where it has, in fact, less taste, less nutritional value. So we were there, and we're trying to sort of help them sort of start businesses and procedures and...
Yeah, and just take some of the stuff we've been sitting on and sharing with a few thousand people a year and kind of growing its impact through collaboration.
Yeah, so, yeah, what you want to do what. So we worked with her trying to do learning traditional techniques and then sort of interpolating that into products which we could feel that they would be able to make profitable so that they would have an economical boost that could then give them also a way of having a bit more pride in their own sort of traditions and culinary. Because, I mean, for instance, in Zimbabwe, they eat, what's the name of the worm?
Mopane
worms, which are like these horrible looking, I mean, they're this
giant
long,
caterpillars.
black, huge caterpillars. And they're actually quite good. But the people there are a bit embarrassed about it, and especially in front of like us, they were a bit embarrassed about eating it. But it's amazing, and they have this rich heritage of eating these insects, and I think a huge possibility in terms of making products that are able to export them. So, I mean, at Noma, we're able to, and we're giving, especially me, I'm given the wherewithal to basically do the weirdest things I can possibly think of. And as a lead user in our fields, that gives us a position where we can try and hopefully inspire other restaurants, other ways of eating. Because also one of the things that I don't think, or one of the real reasons that we started our fermentation and the fermentation lab especially is that we're in 2017 becoming for half the year a vegetarian restaurant. That's because we feel that it's important for our region, our way of eating healthier, and also the future of food is just not sustainable in terms of growing cattle. So the question becomes, how do you make a beet, a carrot, steamed spinach as delicious or as interesting as that côte de bœuf, right? And we're trying to basically accomplish that through these fermentation techniques. Because that's
just let the flavor speak for itself.
Right, because if we're trying to imitate something or even, I mean, for us in terms of creating vegetarian food, it's not like trying to replicate something that could be a fake hamburger or a fake côte de bœuf. It's thinking about how do we reconsider cooking itself for a meal with no protein. And conceptually, you have to sort of shift your whole paradigm in terms of how do you even make dishes. Do the dishes look the same? Are they the same size? Do you use different cutlery? And fermentation for us will be like the
sort of
answer
pathway
to
to that, yeah.
And thank you. Well, this is actually the pathway to that.
Yeah.
So this is a metabolic pathway of enzymatic production. So this is a small part. I think this is yeast, right?
Yeah, this is Saccharomyces cerevisiae.
So this is basically some of the possible outcomes that happen when you put yeast in something. And we can see that there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of possibilities, and yeah. So there's one more vial that's left in your bag.
Don't eat it now.
Don't eat it now. It's this. But this is a product that we actually use, one of the most used fermentations in the restaurant. We use it in small dots as condiments to just give a little bit of umami, a little bit of spice. And what we would like you guys to do is take it home and try a little bit on whatever it is that you feel like it works. When Danny Bowen from Mission Chinese was over doing a pop-up at the restaurant, he put it on steak tartare, and it was amazing. It worked equally well on squid itself. It works on cooked turbot beautifully. But we would hopefully invite you guys to try it on your own. Thank you very much.
Thank you.